You do, of course, emphasize that cannabis unquestionably, and that's your,
Yes.
does cause various harms.
Yes.
Physical harms? Don't say, the record won't catch you. Can you speak up?
Cannabis can cause physical harms. Yes, I agree.
Neurological harms? You agree?
That's unclear whether cannabis can cause neurological harms.
But you won't dispute. You won't emphatically say cannabis does not cause neurological harms.
At this point, I'm not sure I can think of any neurological harms cannabis causes, but you could never say never in medicine. It's possible, but we don't have any evidence it causes neurological harms at present.
If I point out that to you in your own documents,
Go on.
would you accept that?
I don't know. Let me see what you're referring to. It may be where the definition of neurological may be an issue here.
You accept that cannabis does cause psychoactive harms?
It can cause psychoactive harms, yes.
So it causes harms on individuals who use it? You agree?
I do agree. It causes harms, or it can cause harms to some individuals who use it.
On families?
Yes, indeed, it can cause harms to families, like all drugs.
On communities?
It can cause harm to communities, yes.
On a society?
Indeed, it can.
And in your article, you say the effects of cannabis are similar to psychoactive state induced by cocaine and amphetamines.
Could you take me to that point, please?
You forgot. You forgot your own work.
I've produced 1,000 papers. I don't remember every single page of each of them. Could you please take me to where I say that?
Let's look at the next document. Cannabis classification and public health.
You're referring to page?
Page 219, paragraph 5. You see, this is where it becomes laborious, if you forget. Can you read 5.2, please?
Cannabis use usually gives rise to pleasurable feelings of relaxation and euphoria. In some people, however, acute intoxication leads to panic attacks, paranoia, and confused feelings that drive users to seek medical help. These effects are generally short-lived and usually respond to reassurance or the administration of a minor tranquilizer. In some instances, acute cannabis intoxication appears to precipitate a psychotic state that may continue for some time and require treatment with antipsychotic drugs. This is similar to the psychotic states following intoxication with cocaine or amphetamine, but less severe than for smokable forms of crack, cocaine brackets crack, and methylamphetamine. A Danish study has shown about half of the people with a diagnosis of cannabis-induced psychosis experience further psychotic episodes over the following 3 years, although whether this relates to continuing cannabis use is not known.
You won't quarrel with that, we do?
No, what I've said there is I still believe to be correct now.
Yes. And that cannabis also impairs learning and memory. You accept that?
Under the influence of cannabis, people have impaired learning and memory, yes.
All these examples are various examples of harm caused by cannabis.
This is true. Cannabis, as I've said many times, cannabis is not a harmless drug. It can cause harms. In some people, these effects don't necessarily apply to everyone. In fact, they do not apply to everyone, but they can be seen in some people.
It will help if you only respond to what I ask you. These are serious ailments. You accept that?
Some of them may be serious, yes.
All of them are serious.
Well, I'm not sure that a short attack of anxiety or paranoia is necessarily serious, but that's...
It's an ailment.
Well, it's a symptom or a symptom cluster, yes.
Professor, please. It's an ailment.
Well, it's a, and I'm not sure how we define ailment, but normally in medicine an ailment would be seen as something that is enduring rather than transient. But it's, this is semantics. These effects happen, and they are certainly not something people would wish on themselves, and they seek help. So in that sense, you could call it an ailment. Yes.
Well, that will be for the record and argument at the end. Cannabis also contributes to motor accidents.
It does, yes.
Yes. Are you aware of the carnage on South African roads?
I occasionally see reports in the British press of quite severe motor accidents on roads in South Africa, often with quite large numbers of fatalities, presumably due to a lot of people being in a car or a van, yes.
But in your analysis, you do say cannabis is less harmful compared to alcohol.
The evidence we have in the UK, in France, in America suggests, well, I think it proves that the relationship of cannabis to driving is less problematic than the relationship of alcohol to driving. And I've showed you the UK government's reports, which suggested that the harms or the risks from driving, of having an accident when driving under the influence of cannabis was about 1/4 that of driving under the influence of alcohol.
And Professor Nutt, this analysis leads you to conclude that it is irrational to prohibit the use and possession of cannabis whilst allowing the use and possession of alcohol.
Yes, I believe it is irrational to prohibit the use of cannabis whilst allowing people to use alcohol if the reason you're prohibiting the use of cannabis is to protect people from harm.
Now, the fundamental difficulty I have with your entire evidence, your comparison analysis, is that the issue of irrationality or discrimination between the use of cannabis on the one hand and alcohol on the other has not been raised by the plaintiffs in their papers.
Well, as I understand it, my job is to provide the best evidence I can as to the harms of cannabis, and one can only probably understand the harms of any drug in comparison both to the harms of other drugs and to other harmful activities if that data can be accumulated. So, of course, one has to look at comparative harms, otherwise each drug will be treated in a vacuum, and that
Professor Nutt, I'm making a different point. The issue of comparison of harms does not arise in these proceedings. Can I ask you to have a look at file number 1?
I have file number 1, yes.
Look at pages 7 to page 33. Show me where the plaintiffs raise that issue. Take your time.
Pages 7 to
33.
33.
The amended particulars of it.
Yes.
You can look under irrationality or infringement of rights, or better still, under discrimination. Don't rush, take your time.
So I think you're referring to section 10.6 on page 17. The plaintiff challenged the constitutionality.
No. I'm not referring to that. I'm referring to the issue of comparison of the harms caused by alcohol on the one hand and the harms caused by cannabis on the other.
Well, if you go to page 18, section 10.6.3, this is the point I think I've been asked to give my expertise on. The prohibition owes its existence to outdated and unfounded convictions on the harmfulness and dependence-producing effects of cannabis, motivated in part by a now defunct racist political agenda. And I would argue
No, we're not arguing.
Okay.
These are the pleadings.
Okay. But
You see, what you see from pages 7 to page 33 is the case that the defendants have been asked to come and meet in this court.
yes, I see.
Nothing outside that.
I still argue that
No,
it is
not
not possible to consider the harms of one drug without proper reference to the harms of all drugs, and particularly if you are going to make one illegal and the others not.
Professor, do you see any comparison anywhere?
I do not. I don't think alcohol is mentioned in these
you.
pages. No,
Thank you.
I do not think so.
You see, in this country, we have a very salient rule or principle on how issues are raised before court. And that rule is pleadings define the issues. So the purpose of the pleading is to define the issues. In other words, Professor Mark, you don't make out your case for the first time in evidence through witnesses. You understand that?
I'm not sure I am in a position to really comment on the principles of South African legal system. I was asked to give evidence about the harms of cannabis, and that's what I've done.
All I'm asking is whether you understand what I'm saying.
Well, I understand. I think I understand what you're saying.
Yes.
And
Thank you.
and I think I answered the question in relation to that previous point. It seems to me that prohibition, if based on evidence, must take into account the evidence in the way I've presented it.
Yes. So it's either there was an error by the plaintiffs in not pleading the case that you're advancing now in the witness box for the first time, or you were just on the frolic of your own with the evidence of comparison of alcohol on the one hand and cannabis on the other.
Well, I would just repeat what I said, that if prohibition is based on harm, an assessment of harm does, in its fullest capacity, require a comparison with the harms of other drugs, which may or may not be controlled under the legislation. That, to my mind, is the scientific approach, and as a scientist, I've tried to convey the evidence
Yes.
that way.
That I understand, Prof. The only issue is that case has not been pleaded. That's the only issue. Now, the effect of that is that all of these articles that you have presented and your slides, together with your evidence, are of no assistance to the court on the issues that are before this court.
Well, I would have to disagree with you, because if the issue is the harm of cannabis, I've presented a lot of data relating to that, but that's for the judge to decide, I guess.
Yes, but that case has not been pleaded. That's the only point I'm making. Yeah.
Well, we must disagree, I think.
Disagree about pleading a case?
Disagree about the importance of comparative data in making an assessment of a rational decision to prohibit a drug.
Let me go to the second point. I'm going to the second point,
Yes.
which is also fundamental. As fundamental as the first. Your study of harms in the article we dealt with previously
Yes,
was conducted in the UK
correct.
at a one-day workshop.
Correct.
And as the article itself says, its purpose was to give guidance to policy makers in the fields of health, policing, and social care.
Mm-hmm. Correct.
No, don't say anything.
Correct.
And your article states that clearly. Can you turn to page 164?
Yes, I'm on 164.
The second paragraph. To provide, can you see that?
To provide better guidance to policymakers in health, policing and social care, yes.
Yes. And the outcome of your study was not accepted in the UK.
The outcome...
Your proposition.
This study has never been presented. You mean in terms of, has the government changed the Misuse of Drugs Act in the light of our study? Well,
Yes.
as far as I know, the study has never been presented to the government because the government has never allowed an opportunity for a discussion around its findings.
Yes. And in fact, to be fair to you, you said you were previously fired by the UK government.
This is true. I was dismissed from my role as the senior drugs advisor because when trying to present the iniquities or the irrationalities of the UK law to my governments, they considered it to be politically inexpedient, and therefore they dismissed me from my post.
And you expect South Africa, through this court, to accept your propositions?
Well, I would hope that South Africa was more rational than Britain. And I want to say this, that I've come here because it seems to me that you have a constitution which allows a challenge by scientists and by others to irrational laws. We do not have that ability in Britain. We do not have a written constitution. We cannot challenge what I would see as irrationalities in our law, but you can, and that's one of the reasons I have been pleased to take up this case, because it seems to me this is one of the few countries in the world where that question can be properly addressed.
Professor Nat, if your study at page 164 onwards, was made for policy makers. Why do you introduce it in this court?
Because it's the best assessment of the comparative harms of drugs and the individual harms of specific drugs that has ever been performed. And therefore it must be of relevance to this court, because this court is discussing, I believe, amongst other things, the harms of cannabis. And this assessment, the 16-point assessment of the harms of cannabis, has to be relevant.
Aren't policy issues for politicians to consider?
Sorry, could you say that again, please?
Policy issues, are they not for politicians to consider? As your own article says.
Yes. It depends on the nature of the law in each country. Most countries, I believe yours too.
Professor, is your answer yes or no?
It can't be a yes or no answer, because different countries have different politics. The ideal situation, which is usually accepted, although rarely followed, is that experts, through assessing drug harms, come to policy recommendations. And this used to be the way it was in the UK. For the first 30 years, we had a Misuse of Drugs Act, we had an advisory council, and the government accepted the output of the advisory council. It's only in the last 10 years that politics has got in the way of the scientific program. And we have seen politicians interrupt and essentially commandeer the harm assessment process and produce bad laws. And unfortunately, that's where I am in my country. It's a very sad state of affairs that politics should be the overriding decision maker in drug harms, but that's wrong, and I would recommend that you don't follow that policy here in South Africa.
Professor, what question are you answering?
I'm answering the question about whether politicians should decide on drug policy or experts, and I am of the view, as I think most experts are, that experts should decide on policy, because politicians have other motives other than the best for their people.
Do you think in South Africa courts make policy for government?
Well, I believe that this case may have some implications for decision making, and that's why I'm here. I do hope
decision making by whom? By politicians?
Well,
health workers, as you say.
I am hoping.
Policing and social care.
I am hoping that my evidence and the other evidence you're hearing today will help your constitutional court to come to a decision about how best to make decisions about drugs and drug harms. And therefore, it seems to me, at least in South Africa, you have an opportunity to have a proper dialogue about this. In the United Kingdom, we don't, because it's all in the hands of politicians.
For your education, Professor, in South Africa, courts do not make policy for government. Policy is the terrain of the government. You understand that?
I understand that.
Yes. Do you know the nature and extent of alcohol use in South Africa?
I believe it's a leading cause of ill health and violence and road traffic accidents. I believe you have a very serious alcohol problem, particularly in unlicensed and unregulated sales, as well as, of course, quite a lot of regulated use. So I understand it is a significant problem.
Just repeat that. Quite a lot of?
So I think there are two markets, as I understand it, there are two markets for alcohol in South Africa. There's a regulated market, it is a free market, you allow advertisements, and you have a significant consumption of regulated alcohol that is taxed and sold through normal regulated outlets. You also, I understand, have quite a big market in illegal alcohol, shebeens, and also off sales, which is, I know, of a considerable worry to health providers here. I know that South Africa has one of the highest rates of fetal alcohol syndrome in the world, which means that there must be an enormous problem of alcohol consumption in this country.
But do you know the nature and extent of alcohol use as compared to cannabis use?
I don't know those data. I don't know that they exist, but I'm almost certain there was more alcohol use than cannabis use.
Why do you say that, Professor?
Because
when you yourself say you don't know, you don't have the data.
I don't know. But from my conversations with my colleagues with expertise in South Africa, that is the impression I have been given by South African experts.
Only an impression. You never studied that?
I have never formally studied the South African situation. Not specifically, no.
Do you have the knowledge of who uses cannabis in South Africa? The age of initiation?
I do not have that data, no.
Okay. Do you know the nature and extent of cannabis use in the townships and informal settlements in South Africa?
I have not seen any data on that, no.
Do you know the potency of cannabis being used in South Africa?
I don't have those data, no.
Do you know how cannabis is used with other substances in this country?
Yes, I have learnt that quite often there's a mixture of other substances with cannabis, I heard. And those substances include drugs like heroin and fentanyl, and also possibly methamphetamine, and possibly other drugs which don't seem to be psychoactive, but which are put into the cannabis to give some change in flavor or a sense of altered effect.
Have you heard about something called nyaupe?
I have heard of that, and my understanding that is largely an opioid cannabis mixture.
A what?
It's my understanding is nyaupe is a mixture of cannabis with some opioids, like heroin, put into it.
No, you're wrong.
Am I wrong?
With ARVs, antiretroviral drugs.
Yeah, yes. Okay. So I had a discussion about this in Cape Town the other day at the conference, and there seems to be some argument about whether this really is a problem or whether there are just some examples.
I'm asking you a different question, not whether or not it's a problem. Whether you know of nyaupe.
Well, I've heard of nyaupe, but the question is what's in it. And the ARV, as I heard from your local experts, the use of ARVs in nyaupe is not widespread. That is what I've heard. But again, I haven't researched it. You'd have to ask your local experts.
If you're still here, I'll ask you to visit one of the townships nearby to learn about nyaupe. Maybe that will educate you better. Do you know about the acute use of cannabis in this country?
The what use?
Acute use of cannabis.
Well, what proportion of people are using it daily?
Yes.
I do not know.
Do you know the risk behaviors associated with the use of cannabis in this country?
I don't have, as I've established, I don't have any specific expertise on the use of cannabis in South Africa, no. I don't.
What do you know about the connection between cannabis and crime in this country?
As I said, I am not an expert on the South African cannabis scene. I know in other countries there is some relationship between cannabis and crime, but as I've emphasized, certainly in the United Kingdom, it's a very much diminished relationship than we see with alcohol. I don't have any reason to suppose it will be different here, but maybe if it is, then that should be explored.
So without knowledge of all those factors, you must accept that South Africa is a very different country facing different challenges from the UK and countries in Europe.
Unquestionably, it's, you have a very different set of challenges. As I said a few days ago, giving evidence, physiologically, I do not believe that cannabis will behave differently in the South African person as it does in the European. The social context of using cannabis, of course, is different. And what I think one would need to do would be to do a proper analysis in South Africa using the same approach that we have taken in Europe, this multi-criteria decision approach.
I'm glad you said one would need to do a proper analysis. So you can't claim the universality of your UK studies
So I
for
think,
their application in this country.
no, as I said, I think we can be fairly confident that the harms to the user are similar if they are using the same substance. The social harms will differ, of course, and that is why we have separated them into the two separate components, the harm to the user and the harm to society. And it would be perfectly possible to revisit the harms to society according to our scales by South African experts and estimate whether it would be different here. That would be a sensible thing to do, but only
Yes.
South African experts can do that. I can't do that.
So you accept that your UK studies emanating from a one-day workshop will not necessarily be of application here in this country.
So the harms to society may be different. Indeed, they may be.
Yes.
They may be different in other countries too.
And on individuals as well.
No, I don't believe they would be different on individuals because, as I said, I don't see that the physiology of South Africans is so different from that of Western Europeans that there would be a different impact of the drug on the brain or the body. I wouldn't see that as being likely to be very significant.
Let us test that. Are you saying even with the drug mixture, the impact will be the same?
Well,
Given that it's the culture in this country.
that is a different question. And then you're asking a question not about cannabis, but about combinations of drugs.
No, cannabis as the main ingredient.
Well, if cannabis is the main ingredient, it will be cannabis. If people are putting other substances in, you'd have to look at the harms of those other substances. I mean, it's not intuitively obvious that putting antiretroviral pills ground up into cannabis cigarettes would make them more harmful. I think that's just an unknown at present. Certainly putting heroin in would definitely make you more addicted, but then that is a heroin problem, that is not a cannabis problem.
Professor, sometimes it does no harm to accept a fact.
Well, I don't know what the facts are in South Africa, so it's impossible to assume, for me to estimate the different effects of the different combinations without knowing exactly what's in them, and I don't know whether anyone does.
And that's the point. You have no knowledge of the facts in South Africa.
Well, I'd be very happy to look at the facts if they could be presented. I'm not sure you actually have the facts in the way you could interrogate them objectively, but if you do, I would be pleased to see them.
Yes. You said earlier in your evidence in chief that you are aware that South Africa is taking some measures. What were you referring to?
I'm not
Some measures around cannabis legalization.
I'm not sure. Could you remind me when I said that and what it was referring
In your
to?
evidence in chief,
Yes.
you said South Africa was taking some steps or measures.
Well, I understand that the Medicines Control Committee has made some suggestions around the rescheduling of some cannabinoids, I believe. I think I heard that they might also be interested in using my approach to actually look at the harms of different drugs in South Africa.
Is that so?
That's what I heard last week, yes.
So why don't you present your paper there instead of bringing it through this court?
Well, that's a different agenda, and it's I'd be very happy to present. In fact, I did present my paper last Monday in Cape Town, and some of the medicines control people were there, and I think that's why they're interested in perhaps getting me back to go through this process with South African experts.
Have you heard of the Medical Innovation Bill?
I'm not sure.
You were here in my opening address
Yes.
when I read some of the provisions of that bill.
Yes, I remember you presenting that, yes.
Yes.
Yes, yes.
The point really is that these issues that you have raised do not belong in this court. Those are policy issues which should be addressed with policy makers. You get that?
Yes, I believe that policymakers should be addressing these issues, absolutely.
In fact, one of the plaintiff's experts, I think it's Professor Howell, has previously stated that the issues around cannabis legalization or decriminalization, such as this before this court, do not belong in the courts, but must be dealt with by politicians. Can I have a look? Can I ask you to have a look at file 3?
Which volume are you referring to, Mr. Buchanan?
I have the page number.
Some of the page numbers are duplicated in different volumes.
The first volume in file 3.
Sorry, my lord, I didn't catch the page numbers. Oh, thank you.
Page
But commencing at page 415.
Is this the Annexure K balancing harms?
Yes, that's the page.
That one.
The last page of that is page 444.
Do you have that, sir?
I believe so. Yes.
They were discussing balancing of harms, decriminalization of cannabis. Page 444, paragraph 6.8. This is what they say. This court case is timely and will be watched around the world. They were referring to the court case in the Western Cape,
Oh,
where more people and authorities than ever before are asking these same questions. It forms part of a rapidly developing global conversation about harm, human rights, ethics, and appropriate state responsibilities and limits. Good research and expert opinion should certainly play an important role in determining the route ahead. So should legal concerns. However, we believe that these questions are inherently political ones that will require legislative and far-reaching policy changes, and so must ultimately be contested in the political arena. You won't contest that, would you?
I would say this. I would say that the reason we have problems with drugs
Before you
is...
say that, bear in mind that this is the plaintiff's own expert.
Yes, yes, I understand. Drugs are contested in the political arena, but I would contest that they should not be. And this is one of the reasons why the drug laws have failed. They have failed to control the use of drugs. They've, if anything, amplified through the black market the use of drugs. And as I said earlier, the opportunity to come to a country where you can address the drug laws through the courts rather than through politics is one I find very enabling and very energizing. It's yes, politics in the end will decide, but science should ideally play a very important role, as should legislation. And I think the courts here have an opportunity that courts in other countries do not have to help at least, if not move the political agenda, but at least lay in front of the politicians the very serious issues that they should take into account when they are making laws about drugs.
You are wrong, Professor.
Oh, okay.
In this country, courts do not make policy.
What I was saying was that this court has the opportunity to define the criteria of harmfulness, of medical use, and possibly also economic use, that could allow a rational decision that the politicians would have to listen to, and therefore it could inform a very much more rational approach to drug policy than simply allowing politicians to use drugs as political tools, as they have in many countries over the last century.
Professor, now that you know about the medical innovation bill, are you going to make representations?
I have offered, as I said, I have offered myself to anyone who would like to use my expertise to think through the regulation of drugs and also to facilitate the development, particularly of cannabis products as medicines. I am very happy to help assist your government or your medical control agencies in doing that.
The point is, we don't do it through the courts. I'm moving to the third point, my lord.
Yes.
Without accepting your evidence as relevant or as being helpful to the court, there are other issues that arise from your own reports, and I'd like to deal with that. Particularly your UK study.
Which
And this may make, no, I'm not referring you to anything.
Oh.
Just relax. What regulatory framework do you propose for the use and possession of cannabis?
So my view is that each country should decide itself how best to regulate a drug that it decides to regulate. I am, over the last 20 years, have monitored the changes in regulation of cannabis in the Netherlands, in Spain, in Portugal, in the USA, in Canada, and Uruguay. And each have come up with a slightly different approach to regulation. I think the key point about regulation, or the key points, are that the state should control to ensure that it receives the benefits from the taxation, that it can monitor the quality control of the substances provided, that it can regulate the age of access to substances, which in some countries can be 18, some countries 21, that it can ensure there's appropriate education of people who use, and also appropriately monitor any negative health outcomes in relation to the overall consumption. So I think those 5 criteria would be the criteria I would recommend for a regulated market. And then within that, there are obviously issues of formulation, of amount, of the amounts one might be able to possess for personal possession, maybe even the total amount you're allowed to buy or grow in a year. So I could see individual jurisdictions wanting to have their own tailored recommendations for their own population.
You know, Professor Nat, it would have been helpful if you had prepared a report for the purposes of your testimony. Because your proposition in these articles does not tell how to realize that regulation and control of cannabis. Correct?
Correct. No, I was not asked to do that. And to be fair, the most recent data that I provided you in the slides about estimating the best regimes for controlling drugs is very recent. It's not yet been published. It's under review by the British Medical Journal. So I provided that to you with, even though, because I thought it would be helpful to the court, but it's not in the public domain yet.
You are aware that alcohol and tobacco are subject to regulation and control in this country?
Yes.
And you are aware that the current South African legislation allows for both research and medicinal treatment by way of cannabis?
I'm aware of that, but my understanding is that in practice it's proved extremely difficult for doctors to get the license for research and for doctors to get supplies for their patients.
Where do you get that from?
Well, I was
Again.
I was at a conference at the weekend. I was talking to a doctor, a prescribing doctor here, who said it was very difficult. It takes a long time to get permission, and it's very, very expensive also to acquire medical cannabis in this country at present.
So you had that from third parties, you never studied that?
I haven't studied it, but I mean, I have no reason to suppose that a doctor who is prescribing would mislead me.
Mm-hmm. You believe that?
I do tend to believe my professional colleagues, yes.
In your summary's conclusion, I think it's at file 2, page 147. Are you there?
I am.
Paragraph 2.4.1.8, the last paragraph. Are you there? May I ask you to read that?
Therefore,
That's your conclusion.
yes. Therefore, the expert opines that the deregulation and or full legalization of the use and possession of cannabis constitutes an effective means to manage a substance that has been scientifically shown not to present at the minimum, full extent of the harms espoused by prohibitionists and which may have significant therapeutic potential.
What is full legalization?
Well, full legalization is a regulated market of some sort. So possession of the drug is legal and selling of the drug is legal.
So that's what you are for.
I'm for it. So legalization, this is a very important point you raise. Legalization can take many forms. It can take the form of a complete free market, as we see in Colorado. And I'll put on the record, I am not comfortable with that kind of market. But it can also mean regulation like an alcohol market, which we have in your country here, a market where the sale, the age of purchase is controlled, the place it's sold is controlled, the content and the strength is controlled.
So you're not for a blanket uplifting of the prohibition of the use and possession of cannabis?
I am very much against the use of criminal sanctions to punish people for using this drug. I think that is inappropriate in relation to its known harms. It's also had a hugely deleterious effect on research.
Professor, please answer my question.
I'm not in favor of a completely unregulated market. I would not want anyone selling cannabis anywhere to anyone of any age, no.
Is it your proposition that just because cannabis is less harmful than alcohol, therefore the state loses its authority to control and regulate cannabis?
There's a very...
Because alcohol is more harmful.
I'd like to address that in two ways. I'd like to...
Is it a yes or no?
I believe that it is morally very contentious for any state to control a drug that is less harmful than the drug it actively promotes, in this case alcohol. So I think you can make a moral argument that it is wrong to prohibit something that is less harmful than another drug that the state actually makes income from. So I think you can make the moral argument. You can make the health argument that by prohibiting the use of cannabis, you are in effect saying to anyone who wants to have some kind of recreational relaxation from a drug, they must use alcohol, which is a more harmful drug to the user. So you are actually pushing people to greater harms by removing their opportunity to use something less harmful. So that is where I stand in relation to alcohol. A state that not only allows, but in your state encourages through advertising the sale of alcohol has a moral obligation to its people to allow them access to a less harmful alternative. The second answer to your question is there an absolute level of harm that would mean that a drug should be illegal? Now, I've obviously thought a lot about that over the years. I've certainly taken the view that if almost all states in the world accept that the harms of alcohol are compatible with the sales of alcohol. So you have agreed that even though alcohol is very harmful, it can be available because the public get benefit from it. So my view is that a drug which is less harmful than alcohol should be not be controlled if alcohol is not controlled. I believe there are absolute, I am of the opinion that a drug like fentanyl, this super strong opioid, I personally do not ever see that being available in a regulated fashion. There are some drugs which are just too harmful, but cannabis does not meet that threshold of harm where you could say it should be banned even if it wasn't being compared with alcohol. So it's a complicated answer, but it contains
yes,
two.
I agree, it is. Not an answer at all. Are you saying cannabis should be legalized despite its harmful effects?
Yes, I am saying cannabis should be available to adults who wish to use it because it's less harmful than state-encouraged drugs such as alcohol and tobacco.
I see you don't qualify your answer. You're not even saying there should be research first.
We know more about cannabis than any other illegal drug, and I'm confident that a regulated market will serve the benefits of people who want to use it medically and recreationally, and will remove an enormous burden of police time, and will break the black market. Let us be clear about this. The black market is the main driver for these adulterated forms of cannabis, the Niobe, etc. A regulated market doesn't accommodate and obviates the need for people to try to create demand through changing the pharmacology, changing the combinations, inventing new substances like synthetic cannabinoids. The regulated market we have seen in countries where it exists now, 30 years in the Netherlands, 10 years in Spain, nearly 10 years in the USA. A regulated market generally provides greater benefits and reduced crime and reduced health harms.
Professor, with respect, that's a very reckless statement or answer coming from a scientist. Are you saying cannabis should be made readily available immediately to adults, despite the harms that it causes, without the benefit of any research?
Well, there has been a lot of research. We have experience from many, well, let us look, what do you mean by research? What do you mean? So, the Netherlands decided, based on rational choice, it decided to make sure that it knew its young people were going to use cannabis. Because young people around the Western world were. And it decided to make sure that those young people could get access to cannabis without being offered heroin or crack cocaine or methamphetamine. And it did that by creating a regulated market for cannabis, the coffee shops. And that was a social experiment, and the results of that have been well documented, and they are quite remarkable. In the Netherlands, very few young people continue to use heroin. Whereas in other countries, like my country, where we kept criminal sanctions against cannabis and young people could only get it from dealers, we know that almost every dealer in Britain is all offering heroin and crack with cannabis.
I'm afraid I have to stop you there, Professor. So you're not for further research into cannabis, the benefits and the harms of cannabis. You're not for that? For scientific research?
So, I think we have enough evidence to conclude that cannabis should be available for doctors as a medicine and should be not prohibited. I think we have enough evidence on that. Of course, I would strongly encourage that you research the outcomes of any policy change you make, because you need to first ensure that there haven't been some unexpected change effects, some perverse consequences, and also we must work out how to optimize the policies and the medical use. But by taking away the criminal control of cannabis, we will facilitate research. Research is extremely limited at present because of the way it is contained within this illegal status.
Professor Knight, are you for or against further research into cannabis?
I'm always in favor of more research, that is true.
Okay. You're saying cannabis should be legalized because it's less harmful than alcohol, despite the harms that it causes.
I do.
How would you deal with the harms?
I would deal with the harms through the process by which we allow access to those people who wish to use. So I would have registered outlets. We have them. You have them at present. They're called pharmacies. So you could go down the Zurich model of making cannabis available in pharmacies. You could, and I think you might even try different approaches in different parts of the country. You could try the Spanish model of having cannabis clubs where people go and smoke cannabis away from the public eye. You could have the coffee shop, as in the Netherlands. So these are three established ways you could allow access. And I think you might want to do different things in different parts of the country. It may be that there are local needs or local problems which would be better solved by a different approach. You'd have very high quality control, state production, high quality control, good education at the point of sale, proof of identity, proof of age, and also some kind of interview to ensure that people are not suffering, for instance, from mental illness when they're buying. Now, those approaches are not so difficult to instigate, and the income from cannabis would fund those, and also bring other benefits to society.
We have to move on, Prof. So you are emphatic that cannabis should be legalized simply because it's less harmful than alcohol. Shouldn't the focus rather be on the prevention of all harmful drugs, including alcohol and cannabis?
Yes, and I understand the question, and this is, I think you've hit on a very important point, and I would love to reduce the harms of all drugs, but it has to be in a proportionate way to the harms. Reducing the harms of cannabis through criminalization not only doesn't work, but also increases the harms and is unjust. If you were to say to me, and this is what I say to my government, they say, cannabis is harmful, therefore we keep it illegal. And I say, well, alcohol's harmful, why don't you do something about that? And they never answer that question. And the reason they don't answer that question is because many politicians find it difficult to escape from the pressures of the drinks industry. If you really care about harms in your country, you would not focus on the harms of cannabis. You would focus on the harms of alcohol, just like we should in my country. But countries don't do that. Countries don't focus on the harms of alcohol because the alcohol industry is so powerful and it's so effective in controlling political discourse that politicians will not challenge it. You still have alcohol advertising here, even though some countries have got rid of it. You know, so the argument that you're trying to protect the public by keeping cannabis illegal is undermined by the fact that you and all the other people who are trying to argue that cannabis should stay illegal are not trying to change alcohol. If you really cared about harm, you would change alcohol. And one of the ways you can reduce alcohol consumption is to allow people access to a safer alternative like cannabis. So I think legalizing cannabis would have a significant impact to reduce some of the harms of alcohol too.
Aled, would it be convenient to adjourn now? Because we started a little bit earlier today.
It's just after 11. So you wish to have an adjournment?
Yes, I also need to have a look at this.
Yes. A copy has not been handed up for the court. Do you not intend to at this stage? You first want to see what the parties have to say.
That too, and the plaintiffs prepare that. That's their responsibility.
So you first let them see it?
Yeah, that too, yes.
I see.
Thank you.
The court adjourns. Mr.
Thank you, Ma'am. Professor Nat, why do you propose for the legalization of harmful drugs, including cannabis, just because they are less harmful than alcohol?
I propose that this for two main reasons. One is it is morally right, and the second that it will reduce the harms of those drugs, because many of the harms emerge because the drugs are criminalized.
How is that so? When the harm is caused by the use?
Yes, so the harm is caused by the use, but experience tells us that black market use is usually more harmful than the use in a regulated market. And certainly there are many examples of that in other countries with cannabis. And my country has been particularly damaged by the persistent prohibition of cannabis, leading to the development of more toxic alternatives and more harmful and dangerous variants such as synthetic cannabinoids. And I would not want that to happen in your country.
How does the black market contribute to the usage, which causes harm?
So the economics of the black market are very clear. People who sell drugs on the black market want to encourage drug use because that's how they make their living. So we know that the illicit drug trade in the world is the largest commodity trade apart from oil. It's all unregulated, it's all untaxed, and it's associated with an enormous amount of criminality and harm. Currently, you have told me that in South Africa there are major problems with cannabis as well as alcohol use in the townships. This is an unregulated market. If we could bring it under control, you could at least begin to make sure that what people were taking was what they thought they would take. You could potentially eliminate these contaminated or this cannabis to which has been added other substances which could be more addictive and more toxic.
Professor Nat, do you agree that the issue of medicinal benefit or benefits of cannabis is separate and should be subject to further research?
I believe that medical cannabis is an established...
Short answer, please.
We do not need further research to establish that cannabis is a medicine, no.
Are you aware of the South African Drug Master Plan?
No.
Policy on drugs?
I have read it, but I wouldn't say I was an expert on it, no.
Do you know its purpose? Oh, let me tell you what its purpose is. To develop strategies to combat use of all harmful drugs, including alcohol and tobacco. And it focuses on supply and demand reduction. Isn't that a laudable approach to drugs?
Indeed it is, and I think it's, I commend it. I think it's excellent that it has alcohol and tobacco in the policy, which is more than many countries do, including my own. And I think the approach to reduce demand is a very sensible one. But I also applaud the fact that harm reduction is a key feature of it.
But for you, that's not the way to go. Increase, what you want to see is the increase in the risks of harm.
I do
by
not.
By legalizing harmful substances.
As I have explained, the evidence we have suggests that taking control of a drug out of the black market minimizes, or no, reduces the harm that that drug does to the user and to society. And there are examples of that I have shared with you relating to cannabis. There are many examples relating to other drugs. The black market is the worst place to have a drug sold.
Let's move on, Professor. Can I refer you to file 2? I want to deal with your summaries.
Please.
Page
138.
Yes.
Can you read for me paragraph 2.1.2? After all, these are your summaries.
There is credible scientific evidence to suggest that cannabis is effective in preventing and or treating the conditions of and or symptoms associated with the following.
Just go down the list.
Chronic pain, cancer and the side effects of cancer treatment, HIV and the side effects of HIV treatment.
Can you stop there, please? Are you perhaps an expert in HIV and AIDS?
I am
that
not,
field?
no.
Do you know the nature of the HIV and AIDS epidemic in this country?
I do. I have heard of it. It's internationally recognized.
So anyone listening to you, what you said just now, that there are credible scientific evidence to suggest that cannabis can be a cure towards this. Is that not an irresponsible statement to make, particularly in this country, in the context of the epidemic?
I was not saying it was a cure. I was saying
It's not comical.
it could be used, and there is evidence it can be used to
Where's the evidence?
to assist in the symptoms of HIV, cachexia, wasting, and also nausea from the side effects of treatment. There is evidence to that effect. So this could help your population rather than hinder it.
Where's that scientific evidence?
It's in published literature. I cannot quote it Well, it will prevent some of these disorders, yes, but